So y'all, there are things that we just don't like to talk about in our culture, as well as in our homes and in our lives. And two of those things are often grief and loss. I want to just separate the difference between the two, so when I talk about it, you'll know what I'm referencing. So loss is the event, right? It's the divorce. It's the layoff. It's someone dying. Grief is our reaction to that loss. So losses are going to be part of all of our lives. Think of it this way. Loss is going to be like this thread that's going to weave itself in and out of our life, because we're going to have big losses and small losses forever. So how, if loss is a part of our life, how are we supposed to deal with that? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. How do we deal with these losses? How do we grieve? And so I'm very happy to be here with you today, and I hope we can have an open conversation about what grief is, about, excuse me, let me catch up here. Here we go. This is what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be talking about what grief is, not just a definition, but also what grief is to you. We're going to learn a new model of grief that I created called the Grace model of grief. And we'll learn grief work activities, and you'll have an opportunity at the end to do an activity to help you with your grief journey. And then also at the end, we'll finish with a brief Q&A. So, what is grief? Well, grief is understood as the emotions caused by loss or anticipated loss. It's inevitable and universal and part of our human condition. In its severe form, which is called complicated grief or CG, it's been deemed a health hazard with potentially life-threatening implications. Symptoms can include profound sadness, disbelief, longing, seeing or hearing the dead loved one, and somatization. Now, somatization is just, that's that when we experience those physical distress emotions and, like stomach aches and headaches. But as universal as grief is, there still actually remains much that is not fully understood. Research has been conducted and many models have been created, but still there's much work to be done. So what is grief to you? Kind of giving you a definition of what grief is and differentiated loss from grief, but what is grief to you? When I say the word grief, what words come to mind to you? I heard someone say sadness. Despair. Did I hear heartbroken? What else? Fear. Anything else? So if we stood here long enough or if I stood here long enough, I'm sure you would give me enough words to fill up this whiteboard and then some, right? Because we all have these kind of emotions and thoughts that come when you hear that word grief or loss. And so grief is all of those things. It is sadness. It is despair. It is being heartbroken. It is fearing. But grief is so much more. I want to begin by reminding you this, that you and I are created of flesh and bones, but you're also created of stardust. Your body is made up of atoms that are billions, that's with a B, billions of years old. That's a lot of innate wisdom in you. And our amazingly constructed bodies are created to try to heal themselves whenever possible. For example, if we fall down and skin our knee, a scab will form, right? Or if we fall down and break that knee, then our bodies will try to knit the bones back together. Now, I pause here to remind us all that there's times when, even though our bodies are hardwired to try to heal themselves, there's times when that body is going to need support to heal itself. And that can include, if you break a bone, you may need to go to the doctor and get it reset, or if you're grieving and it shifts into complicated grief or prolonged, then you may need a professional support for that grief journey. So if loss is like this thread that's going to weave in and out of our lives, and loss is a normal part of our human condition, how then are we hardwired to try to heal from loss? The answer is grief work. And this is why we're here today. So grief, again, is all of those things, and then all of those words and emotions that we're carrying inside of us that maybe we just didn't share today. But grief is also these three things. So in the Grace Grief Model, which I'll discuss in just a minute, I say that grief is good. How on earth can grief be good? Because grief, if we do it in a healthy way, this thing we call grief work is how we heal from loss. That's like a mic drop moment right there. If I had a mic, I'd have to drop it. Grief, the very thing that so many of us will run from, is exactly the thing that if we do it in the right way, a healthy way, is how we heal from loss. Grief is just the genesis. It's going to ebb and flow in our lives. It's a constant part, and it should be a constant part of our lives. And it needs to be part of our pattern of being. And grief is a gift, and I'll explain more of that in a minute. It's this amazingly powerful gift that each of us is offered. I'm going to explain a little bit more about these. So grief is good, but you're saying it doesn't feel very good, right? The truth is we can't get over loss. We can't get around loss. We have to go through it. These losses, again, these big and small losses, and even the small ones can accumulate. It's not uncommon that someone will come to see me and we do their grief timeline, and it's like they say, well, I only have this small loss, but it's an accumulation of it. And finally, it's this one straw that broke the camel's back, and then the floodgates open. So big losses and small losses are going to run like that thread through our lives. But again, grief work is how we heal. Grief is going to ebb and flow. Kind of like that ocean wave that comes in. Sometimes you can see the wave coming in. Sometimes you see the emotional wave of grief coming in. You can just feel it. And it hits you and you're in it. But then there's other times you could be driving down the road and all of a sudden, boom, like a rogue wave that just overtakes you. But grief is going to be a constant in our lives. And again, remember that that's not a bad thing, because ultimately those emotions, those waves that are coming in, are actually coming to heal you, to help you process, to help move you forward. So many of us were raised with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model of grief, right? We know the stages of grief pretty good. Denial, anger, bargaining. Bargaining, y'all, is that thing where you're trying to justify it in your mind, kind of that mental aerobics. Depression, and then acceptance. Well, this is a wonderful model, and most of us in this room have been taught this. It's called the stage-based model. It's a wonderful model, but even Elizabeth Kubler-Ross didn't intend for us just to stop. Most of us use this like a checklist. The problem is it's not a checklist, and I'll give you an example. So a few years ago, my mom died. She had been very ill, and I know she died because I was there when she died, and I did her funeral. But this funny thing happened. Months later, her birthday rolled around, and I caught myself in a store literally reaching for something that I thought she would like for a birthday present. Or, about Christmas time that year, I caught myself reaching for the phone to call her. So there are parts of my subconscious, even though I did that, I went through all those stages. There are parts of my subconscious that jumped all the way back up to denial. Was that a bad thing? No. Did I do this wrong? No, but I had treated it like a checklist. It's not a checklist. Grief should be a constant pattern of our life. And what was missing is that we have to rinse and repeat. We have to go back to whatever bubbles up. In my case, it was denial. I needed to go back and allow myself to accept that death a little bit deeper for my journey. So when each of us goes through our grief journeys and you catch yourself thinking that I'm done, I've already grieved that loss. You may or may not have. Don't be surprised if it bubbles back up. And it's an invitation for you to grieve a little bit deeper. So I want to show you why I think grief is a gift. And I'm actually going to draw it on the board rather than show you that video. I think it may be a little more helpful for you. So imagine you're on a seashore, okay? It's a nice, calm day. And here's you on your seashore. Now, grief comes in like a wave of emotion, right? So here's the emotions. They're coming in. Emotions, feelings. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm not going to use them interchangeably. The grief comes in, but what do we usually do? But again, our culture, the way we were raised, very few of us were taught how to grieve in a healthy way. And so what do? We block it. We don't talk about it, right? We will avoid it like anything. We avoid it in 1,000 different ways. We overwork, we overeat, we overmedicate, take your pick. But the thing about grief is it's coming to heal you. And so it won't stop. The emotions won't stop. They will keep coming. And so it'll come again. And guess what? We will block it again. This is too often the pattern. And then this pattern will repeat itself. Emotional waves will come in, we block them. Emotional waves, we block them. We don't process them, we deny them. Until eventually one of two things will happen. Either we'll stop blocking them and start dealing with our stuff, or these waves will mount up like here's my tidal wave, like a tidal wave. And guess what? This person kind of looks like this at this point, right? It is not uncommon that sometimes the first time I see someone is after the tidal wave has hit them. And maybe it's landed them in the hospital with either a physical illness or maybe their first panic attack. Guess what? You think you're blocking that? Your body will keep the score. Your body will keep the score. And so I want to show you, in just a minute, I'm going to show you how to process those waves. I'm going to give you the cheat sheet.
Imagine this is you.
Oops, we don't want to listen to that one. So I just want to introduce this thing that I call the grace grief model. So as a pastor and a licensed counselor, I've helped many people deal with grief and loss over the years. And it was while working with patients at Menninger, and I would meet with patients there one-on-one, and I also did a grief group, that I began to recognize this kind of gap in current grief models. And so I couldn't find a model that allowed me to work with my patients and to incorporate CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. It's an evidence-based form of therapy, and allow the patients to fully share their narrative, their stories, and wrap all that up in a spiritual context. Also, in secular terms, we call that meaning making. So I couldn't find that, and I kept looking for years, and finally I said, okay. It was during my time in my doctoral program, I developed this, and it was out of necessity because I needed to use this for my clients and my patients. And so the grace grief model was formed. And so I named it GRACE because it kind of spells out what it is. It looks at grief as a gift of reparative renewal and cathartic constructivism for effectual healing from loss. And the other reason I called it GRACE is because in my faith tradition, I think and I believe that it's through God's amazing grace that we are gifted that we are hardwired with this ability to process grief. And so the GRACE model also, during my research, I identified these 3 things that were needed, yet missing from most grief models. And so the GRACE model includes these 3 things. Individualization, which just means paying attention to you, not giving you a cookie cutter model that works for everybody. Attention to gender, paying attention to gender differences. And spirituality, including the client's own spiritual and or religious understanding into their grieving process. So moving forward, the so what here is how can we use grace in our life as far as the grace grief model? And I'll tell you this, that this is actually a workbook that I have in process, and so hopefully by next year I'll be able to share parts of that workbook with you. So I'm going to share what I do have prepared now with you to help you in your grief journey. So you're getting a little bit of a preview on that. Okay, so how do we deal with these waves of emotions, right? The waves are coming. What do we do? I want to give you your cheat sheet. This was developed when I was at Menninger. This idea came to me, and I worked with a doctor there, Dr. Colleen O'Byrne, who helped me kind of gel this formula. So I give her a lot of credit for this. Here's the life hack I wish I had on how to deal with emotions, but especially in this case, how do I deal with grief emotions? Y'all, it is elegantly simple, but it is so powerful. You know what? I've got these up here. You probably would rather look at them there. Number 1. Can you tell I'm used to teaching? I keep wanting to write on the board for y'all. Number 1, feel it. How simple can that be? Allow yourselves to feel the emotions. This is often where we really get stepped up, though. We stop those feelings. We don't want to be sad. We don't want to be whatever it is. Allow yourself to feel, fully feel, whatever it is that's rolling. Sometimes this wave is just sad. I'm just sad. Sometimes it's a hot mess of stuff coming in. Feel it. Number 2, name it. Again, that sounds so simple. The other term for this would be validate your emotions. It's not uncommon that's the second step is where a lot of people will start to come see me because they have these feelings and yet they don't know what they are. For example, I was working with a woman whose husband had died, and he died from a very long, prolonged illness. And she came to me and she said, we were writing her emotions down, and she said, identifying her wave, I just feel sad, right? I just feel sad. And I kept asking her to explore her feelings a little bit deeper. And then finally she said a few more things, and then finally it came. She says, I feel relief. She felt relief because he was out of his misery, he was out of pain, but also she was out of that caretaker role, which was quite demanding for her. And she had felt such shame and guilt for that sense of relief that's what was keeping her stuck. And so not just feeling those emotions, but actually naming them, taking the time to write them down and name them is going to be critical. I want to pause here to remind you of something very important. If your grief journey has been long and arduous, and if you're struggling with anything that looks like complicated grief, and if your emotions are mounting up to where the tidal wave's close, you can't process this alone. It's not even recommended. You will become, no pun intended, but it's called emotionally flooded. And so what I really encourage you to do is seek professional help. Talk to your doctor, see a psychotherapist, go visit, your clergy, and they can help direct you to somebody. Because it's not a good idea to try to process this alone when you're up here, right? What we want to do is catch it down here before we're tumbling in the tidal wave. We want to feel it. Allow the wave to wash by. Feel it. Number 2, name it. What is it, or what is all that we feel? What is that hot mess of stuff coming at us? And then, number 3, learn from it. Again, remember, your body has this amazing amount of innate wisdom in there. And these emotions really are coming to help you process your losses and to help you overcome and to heal. And so feel it, name it. And if you do those two things, you have to do the first two things because you're not going to get to the learn it part if you haven't done the first two. But if you do those first two things, you will be surprised. If you sit there, you will be able to identify what lessons these emotions are trying to share with me. What lessons am I to take from this experience as I sit here and I feel with all this hot mess coming at me? Learn it. And when you figure out what that is, that's the gift. That's the gift that grief is bringing to you. So I want to show you a couple of activities that we use in the Grace Grief model. Again, they're pretty simple, and yet they hold so much power in each of them. Your personal grief timeline. That's simply where you start with your birth and go out to today. And then you sit there with, a friend, or maybe just with yourself, or maybe with your psychotherapist, and you note the losses that are bubbling up. Not every loss that ever happened in the span of your whole life, but whichever ones are coming to you, whichever ones whichever ones are entering your dreams at night, whichever ones you're waking up thinking about. They can be small losses, they can be big losses. This can help with awareness. I worked with a woman who came in to see me, and her grandmother died. Her grandmother had been very ill. Her grandmother was very, very old, I think she was even close to 100, but she had been very ill for a long time, so it wasn't a surprise that her grandmother was going to die. But when her grandmother died, she cratered. And it wasn't until she did this exercise that she realized why. So grandma's death, it was the first major trauma she'd experienced in her life. But when she did this exercise, she realized all the other small losses that she had never dealt with, right? There was also another woman I worked with who, when she did this exercise, she realized that she had forgotten that her best friend died when she was 6. She lost that memory. It was so repressed. And so there are times when this can be a great exercise, but again, for many of us, we need to do this with a professional, because sometimes it can bring things that we might not need to be handling alone, nor do we need to. I was having this conversation before this presentation, and it's this. Y'all, we're not created to try to do all this stuff by ourselves. God knows we keep trying to. In our westernized culture, we've been taught, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? That is such a setup. That is such a setup. Knock that notion out of your brain, because that's doing more harm for you than good. We need community. You were created to live in community, and you're created to heal in community. There are times you will need your friends, your family, your doctors to heal. So that's the grief timeline. The personal grief model, that's something we're going to do a little bit later, so kind of pay attention to this one. So for the personal grief model, what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a piece of paper, and we're going to fold it in half. And on one side, we're going to write how I grieve, right? Not how you wish you grieved. And by the way, no one's going to look at this, so you can put anything you want. We're not going to judge it. How you grieve now. For some people, it's, I cry. For some people, it's I do not cry. For some people, it's I listen to music. Whatever it is, whatever your go-tos are when you experience a loss, what do you do? And then on this column over here, we want to write, where did I learn that? Was there a person that taught you that? And if it was taught to you, maybe by a family member, was it explicit? Did they say, big boys don't cry? Or was it implicit? Did you just never see anyone cry? at a funeral? Was it, maybe it wasn't a person, maybe it was the songs and the movies and the TV shows you were watching during your formative years. We'll go through this in a minute, but this will help us become aware of how we grieve now. Because if we're going to move forward and create a healthy grief model that's individual for us, we got to figure out what we're doing now that needs fixing. And then third is a personal grief journal. So I actually went through this, so I'm going to slip through these slides pretty quickly here. The personal grief journal. I want to show you this. This is an actual journal from one of my clients who I've been sharing with permission. The names are covered, but this is a woman who is dealing with her grief. She has Alzheimer's, and it's getting worse and worse. And so she wanted to write, and so she wrote a poem to her husband. And her husband is her caregiver. And she writes, "He watches me, loves me, walks with me, which keeps me stable, and I live with joy." Here she is with, for her, what is a terminal, catastrophic illness for her, and yet she still finds joy. And for her, how she copes and how she finds joy is writing journals, and oftentimes poetry. So also when it comes to our grief work, I've incorporated into the Grace Grief model a lot of different topics, which I'm going to just kind of highlight because I think they're important topics, whatever model you choose to use for your grief journey. These are some topics I highly recommend that you consider. So I'm going to go through each one and just explain it briefly. So it's helpful to know that there are different types of grief, right? For example, we all need to know that there's normal grief. Y'all, grief is normal. There's nothing wrong with us when we grieve. That's actually healthy. However, there's also abnormal grief, which becomes complicated and prolonged, and that can actually become a pathology and a diagnosis of complicated grief. That requires professional support. If any of you actually are concerned that may be something you're struggling with, come talk to me afterwards and we'll talk about symptoms. Normal grief in general is brief and controllable, brief in quotations. We all grieve at different paces. Complicated is severe and or prolonged, and it definitely is disruptive to our life functioning and even our mental and physical health, and it can become very severe. Also, I want you to consider that there are personal impacts of grief, and they affect people very differently. So how someone else in your family grieves may be different from how you grieve. It affects our brain, and here actually shows an image of someone struggling with grief and how it impacts their brain. It affects our concentration, our short-term memory, decision-making, and so much more. Definitely affects our body. That chronic stress that comes from acute grief causes real aches and pains and puts us at risk for all types of illness. As we grieve, it's important to accept the loss. Kind of when I showed you that list, denial was number one, I had to go right back up there and keep accepting the loss, right? Acceptance is a big part of the grieving process. Radical acceptance is this wonderful idea that's a term that comes out of DBT, Marsha Linehan. Radical accepting is accepting what happened, even though we don't like it, even though we don't agree with it, but fully accepting that, yeah, it is what it is. And then moving through that pain. Remember the person on the seashore, right? You have to feel it, you have to name it, and you have to learn from it. You have to move through the pain. You have to let the wave wash by you. There's no stopping it. Because if there is, the tidal wave is coming. I want to share with you an example of learning from it. So Fred Rogers from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was often afraid of scary things as a young boy. And what helped him move forward was learning that instead of staying stuck in the emotions of his fears, his mother taught him, look for the helpers. And this is a message that I've shared with others. When I was working 2 years ago, y'all, Hurricane Harvey, I was working with a family I was working with the mother and the children of a family whose husband, grandfather, and 2 uncles died while helping save others during the hurricane. And the children were so fixated on the death, they were kind of stuck in those emotions, and the mom too. And it wasn't until we allowed them an opportunity to kind of process and think about the healers, the helpers that came into their lives during and after that event, that they were able to begin to process in a healthy way. So if you're really stuck in a traumatic grief, this wonderful words by Mr. Rogers, who would guess? Some of you don't even know who Mr. Rogers is in this room, maybe. This is a beautiful sentiment, and it's a powerful message. I want to talk about stigma. So for many of us, grief can become prolonged and complicated again, and professional help will be required. And what too often keeps someone from going in to get professional help, whether they just are grieving a little bit and want someone to talk to, or they're grieving a lot and their life is impaired, it's stigma that often prevents people from going to get help. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, 1 in 5 adults in America experience a mental illness. 1 in 5, y'all. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, we can just count around the room. We're in the room. We're in every church, in every place of worship. It's in every house, whether we want to recognize it or not. Nearly 1 in 25 adults in America, that's 10 million people, live with a serious mental illness, and half of all chronic mental illness begins by the age of 14, 3/4 by the age of 24. 60% of people do not seek treatment, and the major reason why is stigma. So some of y'all are too young to remember this, but not too many years ago, a couple generations ago, cancer was heavily stigmatized. I remember this as even clergy, especially in some parts of the country. You wouldn't go to someone's house with cancer because they may be sinning, and that's why they got the cancer. Or they would say, oh, well, it may be contagious, right? Some of you are nodding. You know what I'm saying is true. It wasn't until we started talking about cancer, it wasn't until we started researching and funding that lives were changed and lives were saved. Cancer no more is stigmatized. We couldn't even imagine not bringing a casserole to someone with cancer, or giving them a call, or sending them a letter or a Facebook post, right? That's not always the case regarding some of the mental health issues. Not yet. A lot of them are still being stigmatized, but just like cancer, it's changing. And how it changes are conversations like what we're having today. Conversations that you take out to your families, because that's where the change begins. Conversations that go into your churches and places of worship, where you openly begin to say, you know what? I'm struggling with grief. And it may be serious, I don't know, but I think I'm gonna go talk to somebody about it. Culture. Whatever grief model you use, I hope that you consider culture and different cultures, because it's one thing to know how we grieve, but it's also so rich and helpful sometimes to look at how other cultures grieve. So one picture shows Dia de las Muertas. So Dia de las Muertas, isn't that November 1st? Y'all help me out, right? It's November 2nd? Okay, so it's November-ish. I'm getting the 1st or 2nd. But so it's a Mexican holiday celebrated throughout Mexico, and also with anyone from Mexican heritage, or those of us that don't even have Mexican heritage, that we just like celebrating it. It is when family and friends gather to pray for their deceased family and friends, and it's a celebration. And in Mexican culture, death is viewed as a natural part of the human cycle, right? And some of us that maybe were raised on farms, we can appreciate some of that from more of an agrarian cycle, where death is just a cycle of life. We have fallen away from that. It is not uncommon that I will be doing a funeral and an adult will come up to me and they will say, and when I say adult, I'm not talking 20-year-old, I'm talking like 40, 50-year-old, and they tell me, this is the first funeral I've ever been to. Not that people haven't died in their lives, but death is not part of their culture. Death is not part of what they wanted to talk about. So I want to share with you another culture. See if I can do this right for Cody. This is the Seneca Native Americans. And this recording, by the way, was made over 90 years ago. And you will hear these people, they're indigenous. This is the death chant. And we're just going to listen to just a few seconds of it. Goes on and on. It's just this soulful sound of lament, right? I mean, when they are grieving someone they miss, they just grieve with their whole being and they sing it into this communal chant. How beautiful, how powerful. And the fact that they're not just grieving alone, but grieving in community, how powerful. Do we do that? Do you do that? I also want to share with you, this is a ceremonial dance called the haka dance. It's from the traditional Maori tribe in New Zealand. Now this dance it's a ceremonial dance of the Maori culture that was traditionally sending their warriors off to battle, but it's been adopted in many different ways and it's used at weddings and celebrations. You might even notice they'll do it at some soccer games, but it's also used at funerals. And this shows a school, and these children, their youth, have lost to death a classmate. And I want to show you the haka dance. It's about 1:50. We're going to watch the whole thing. Weddings and stuff. What did you say? What did y'all say? Different, right? I mean, I wasn't raised doing anything like that or seeing anything like that, right? What did you notice? Their eyes. What about their eyes?
They seem
Angry. What could they have been angry at? Death. Their classmate in the prime of their young life killed. Angry. You betcha. What else did you see? They come together as a community. This is something they would have, you could tell this wasn't their first time doing it, right? This is something they would have learned from little bitty on. This is part of their culture. How powerful. They use their whole body to grieve, right? When grief hits us, doesn't it feel that way sometimes? Now we put we put a stoic front on, but how freeing to be able to grieve like this. I show these because there are pieces of other cultures that we may need to embrace in the way we grieve. Do your haka dance. May or may not want to do it in public, that's up to you, but do your haka dance. Sing your chant with your whole body, with your whole being. Consider celebrating not just the loss, but also that the person was there, like in Dia de los Muertos, celebrating life and life cycle. There's so much that we can incorporate from other cultures that could help us grieve in healthier ways. A few other things that I almost always incorporate in the grief work is music. Music touches different parts of our brain than language does. It's so powerful, right? We've all been driving down the road and a song comes on and all of a sudden, we start to feel these emotions. We're thinking, where did that come from? It was a trigger from something maybe we heard years ago, who knows? But one of the things that you can do to help, this is a coping tool, one of the things you can do in your grief journey if you're stuck is create a grief soundtrack. Now this isn't necessarily just sappy songs that it's all gonna make you cry. Might be, but these are songs that will help you move forward from being stuck where you are right now. When I did a grief journey at Mininger, taught the grief journey class, we would do this, and I was always surprised at people's song selections. And I'll never forget this one woman who had just had major trauma. Her family was perished. And she stood up and belted out. In the class, all I do is say, on the computer, type in, and we'll listen to it, right? But she took it a step further, and God bless her for doing it, but she stood up and belted out, "I will survive," right? What is your grief song? Do you need to create a grief soundtrack to help you move forward? I highly recommend it or considering it. Art. Art is also another wonderful way to express your feelings, those feelings that kind of get trapped inside of us, like the woman who was unable to express a lot of her feelings, and yet I showed you the Alzheimer's patient who was able to still write poetry. Here's examples of art. This is Rosalind Fisher, who is a photographer, and she is famous for doing photography that's very microscopic, like photography of bees and so forth. She has struggled with a grief in her life, and to help her grieve, she decided to do a book of tears. And she took slides of tears under the microscope. Under the microscope, this is what tears look like. So this happens to be a tear of an onion. Here is a tear of grief. And here's a tear of someone laughing. She used what was familiar to her. She used what was in her wheelhouse, what she knew, to help her grieve. What do you have? What gifts and talents do you have that you can use to help you grieve, or maybe to help those in your family grieve? Here's another example. Candy Chang lost someone very dear to her, who was like a mother to her, raised her. And Candy Chang is also an artist and a designer and an urban planner in New Orleans area. And she took everything that she was and knew and grieved in a way that became an international movement. She took this old abandoned house in New Orleans and put chalk paint on it and white lines that say, "Before I die," and then left chalk and let people write whatever they wanted to write. It was so popular that before long she had to do another house and then another house. And then eventually she had requests from around the world. And so what you'll notice is there are these little pop-up walls from around the world where people are writing their affirmations of before they die. She helps mourners mourn. And the other thing is, I know this from working with my patients that struggle with suicidality, both in the group and in one-on-one patients. It helps turn a conversation from reasons for dying into reasons for living. Again, what ways can you use your gifts, like Candy Chang and Rosalind Fisher, to help you grieve and to help those around you grieve? Food is a huge comfort for many of us. It's incorporated often into the grief process. If you've ever come to church at a funeral, and if you're Protestant, And Catholic, you've seen the casseroles. The sad thing, though, for many of us is what happens when the casseroles stop coming, right? And there's also this phenomena that pastors know about. It's called a non-casserole event. There is certain griefs that are what we call disenfranchised. I saw this in the 80s with the AIDS epidemic. No one brought casseroles to them. There are certain mental health issues that working with one mom whose one daughter had a physical illness, emails, texts, cards, people dropped casseroles off. The other daughter had struggling with a serious mental health issue, radio silence, disenfranchised, the non-casserole event. If you're struggling with a non-casserole event in your life, let your family know, let your friends know, let your place of worship know. So I want you to take that piece of paper, and does anybody need a piece of paper? I have extra paper. You'll just need a paper and a pen, or you can do this on your phone. Thanks, Cody. So this is an opportunity to kind of practice what we've been talking about. This is one of the activities, and this is your personal grief model, not how you wish it were, not how you hope it will be, but how it actually is today. How do you grieve? And so this model will help us learn how we currently grieve and where and why we learn to grieve that way. I don't expect we're going to just take about maybe 4 minutes to do this. This will just help you lean into this. You'll take this home and maybe finish this, or you'll take this to your therapist and finish this. If you're really struggling with grief and if you have complicated grief, I'd really rather you not do this model. Come talk to me afterwards. Okay, we'll just kind of pause there, and for those of you that would like, take this home and work on it a little bit more. And again, if you're working with a therapist, take it to your therapist and see if this is a good tool for you to use or not. For most people, it's pretty helpful as far as just awareness. No pressure, but would anybody like to share anything from their personal grief model?
When you sit all together as a family reminiscing is quite good. You don't sort of shut the person out. You talk about him and what we used to do, and that eases. Do you know what I mean?
So if I hear you right, you're saying one of the things you do to grieve is to sit around with your family and talk about, in this case, the loved one that's deceased.
The funny things I did or what you went through.
Yeah. Funny memories, things that you went through. That's beautiful.
That eases.
So you would write that down over here, right? We sit around as a family, we gather, we talk about our deceased loved one in ways that are healthy. Where did you learn that?
Well, I'm the youngest of 10, and 8 of my family have died with lung cancer. So there's
Sorry
only
to hear
2
that.
of us left, but my brother died of a heart attack, but Barry was funny. My brother Barry was funny. We sort of talk about what he did and everything, and we have quite a good laugh.
So it sounds like your family, this is part of your family culture. So you learned this from your family, and you might have even noticed, if you think about it, you might have even seen your parents or your grandparents do the same thing. That would be an example of a healthy way to grieve, right? But some of us, we've learned unhealthy models, so it's important to write that down too. I worked with a man who was taught from little bitty on, big boys don't cry, big boys don't cry, and here he was in his 30s, and he had lost someone very significant in his life, and it had been over a year, and he was unable to shed one tear. And he didn't realize where that came from until he did this exercise, and he realized, I've been taught my whole life, big boys don't cry. And so he had to give himself permission to change that, what was a very unhealthy grief model. And no judgment as far as who he learned it from. We teach what we know, right? Once you're aware of how you grieve, then you can move forward in your grief model in ways that are healthy. We take the things that are working, we remove the things that aren't. So y'all, thank you very much for having this conversation today. If there's anything that the Hope and Healing Center can do for you regarding grief, please let them know. If there's anything I can do for you, I'm here after this presentation. So bless y'all, and remember that grief should be a pattern of our life, and so invite it in. And especially during the holidays, maybe invite grief at the table. Thank you.